Hello and welcome to the second part of episode 300 of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. We are celebrating the last 100 episodes and everything that's happened over the last 3 years. In this part, we will discover how our guests changed their own ways of working over the last 3 years. So more or less from episode 200 to 300, and also how their views that the role of work plays in their lives has changed. And we'll also hear about what else they've heard about other people thinking about work in their lives. So in part 1, which was released before this one, our guests answered the question, what do you think is going to stay the same in remote work for most knowledge workers for the next 3 years? And what do you think is going to change? And for part 3, next part, we will look in more detail about how this podcast has changed and what our guests would like to see covered in the show. And I've even managed some outtakes, which will go in at the end of that episode. So if you're a new listener, welcome. You're entering the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. My name is Pilar and I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant, which is the company behind this show. And you can find out more about what we do, all our blog posts, all the past episode show notes over at virtualnotdistant.com. If you are a regular listener, and actually also if you're a new listener, I would love to hear from you, how you have changed the way in which you work over the last 3 years, or whether you view work differently now and how. So for that, we have the contact form on the website, but also Pilar at virtualnotdistant.com. Of course, there's also Twitter and LinkedIn. Let's get to our guests today. Most of our guests were already working remotely in 2020, but even they had to change the way in which they were working because working from home during a pandemic was not the same as working in the way we had chosen and loved to work in. And that's a really important point to remember, that the remote work during the pandemic was not the same as the one we had experienced before. And hopefully, more importantly, it will be different from the one we're going to experience in the future, fingers crossed. And I was feeling this quite strongly during especially at the beginning of the pandemic. So episode 229 is all about how some seasoned remote workers and advocates experienced this suddenly working from home, everyone with restrictions and huge uncertainty. Now, listening back to the conversations in this episode, I was struck by the diversity in what our guests focused when they had to talk about how they had changed, from what their day-to-day might look like, to how they viewed their job, to how the job itself changed. So let's start with a collection of reflections about how the work or the approach to the work changed. So first we'll hear from Theresa Sigilito-Holema, how delivery of training and consultancy has changed for her. And then we'll hear how Pinar Akaya delivered some of her wine tasting workshops online. And she's an international trainer, but she's also currently studying for the diploma with the Wine Spirit Educational Trust. And she has a podcast in Turkish called Juliet's Wine. Then Maya Middlemiss is a commercial writer, and she writes about remote work and the future of work. She will reflect on what has changed at her end. So Theresa, Pinar, then Maya.
Completely. It's completely changed. And I'm still getting over the shock, but that's fine. So it used to be that my client, so I'm a consultant, a trainer, and I used to fly often towards training locations where other people would fly in, and we would have, for instance, a 2-day training. And it was great. We could see each other, learn together. We spoke about cultural diversity. We spoke about virtual working, team dynamics, leadership. Now, I don't travel at all. It's all completely behind the screen. And so I'm designing and giving blended learning programs. So there's something, for instance, I call a 3x3. So it's 3 hours, 3 times. And in between, for instance, 1, 2, or 3 weeks with some sort of homework or assignments in between that colleagues will do together. And it's fine for me. I don't mind doing this. There's some real good benefits to this as well. But there's also some real good benefits from a learning point of view, because the learning actually gets closer to the work. It used to be that we were off-site, which has some advantages. You can, clear your head and things like that. But now, given the sort of the idea that you were in the office or we're at home, and then we have an assignment and we can apply the learning, I think there's some really interesting advantages from this new way of giving programs for myself.
And with your wine expert hat on, I remember in the first, so I think it was in the 2020 IAF's conference, which was online, you ran a wine tasting session online.
Yeah. I mean, who would have thought, right? Who would have thought in maybe 5 years ago that you could actually an online wine tasting? It was like very sort of disturbing even as an idea. But yeah, it was possible. And I just saw that actually it is possible to do something like wine tasting, which is very sensory, obviously, because you have to taste, you have to see, you have to touch, smell, right? So you use basically all of your sensory feeling and everything that's included. And if this is possible, I think many things are already possible. So we did this, and probably everyone was happy around it because we were doing in a, I would say, synchronous way where we were, tasting the same thing, maybe trying to find out a common point, which probably we would not focus on that much if we were in the same room. Yeah, I think that was a nice experience. And the wine tasting example for me is an extreme one where you wouldn't, normally think having a wine tasting session online. But I did several of them afterwards, and it was all very good.
Did you find as well, because I love that you mentioned that we focused maybe on something that we wouldn't have focused if we were in the room together. Did you discover anything else that you thought, that's part of this, where actually we wouldn't have come up with that? Or I don't know, can you remember anything else either in that session or later ones?
The things that people were sharing, like their exchanges, their ideas or their reflections, were a lot more impactful, if I may say so. Because normally around the table, if we're together, probably people would say things, but we would be more focused on the wine, the glasses, and then, the taste in our palate. But then because that was an online session, what people said was actually triggering what I was thinking as well. Because if somebody finds, for example, in this wine, let's say a black pepper aroma, you would immediately look into it and just say, "Oh yeah, do I feel the same? Do I smell the same aroma?" So I think it was more empathetic in that sense, and more sort of focused to listening to other people and what they feel and stuff. Because you're not face to face. And then whatever they say becomes even more important to say, am I feeling the same? Can I find the same taste? Can I find the same smell or aroma? We were listening to each other even more in an online wine tasting session.
Wow, I hadn't thought of that. We use the wine to communicate, actually, and to help us communicate more. Wow, love it.
The way I work, really not so much because of having been working in this way for such a long time. I suppose the way I talk about my work, the way I think about it, the way I explain it to other people, it's become easier and more normalized. People can understand it. And for me, what's really interesting is the kind of work I'm doing, the themes that are emerging now, and the way that the conversation is moving, because I work in both future of work and also in different emergent technology spheres like collaboration and money and things like that. And all these things are now colliding in really interesting ways, which I never could have envisaged 3 years ago.
Of course, Maya, who you heard right at the end, is also the co-host of the What's Going On episodes in the shows. So many of you will be familiar with her own experiences and her view of, what's going on. So while Theresa, Pinar and Maya have shared how their experience of the work has changed, the next set of reflections will cover how our guests' experiences of what's around the work has changed. So let's hear from Dr. Richard McKinnon, psychologist, coach and host of My Pocket Psych. Then we'll hear from Bree, who also writes about remote work. And then you'll hear from Simon Wilson, facilitator of many years.
I always did a lot of remote work. I did a lot of my coaching via video for years because I was working with clients all over North America, all over Asia. But at the same time, I also did a lot of, with hindsight, needless business travel. I did an awful lot of travel in Western Europe. And of course, during pandemic time, all my work was remote. And I realized I don't have to do this much travel unless everyone wants it, unless the client and I think it's a good idea. So I have refocused my efforts. I have looked anew at some of the ways that I work. And of course, when I look at how things were 3 years ago, I kind of feel a little bit resentful that I wasted so much of my time going through train stations and airports when I could have been either wrapping up work for the day and heading home or doing something I really wanted to that was work related. So I've seen the efficiencies and the benefits of working remotely. And now for me, face-to-face delivery is the exception rather than the norm.
Yeah, I mean, it's changed a lot. So I've moved home from Canada back to Australia now, and I work from home mostly. I don't even work at cafes as much as I, did pre-pandemic. I have, quite a good office set up. I have, a deck with a good table and chairs out there as well. So I'm finding a lot of change in environment in my own home this year, and so I'm enjoying that a lot. I've also been traveling a fair bit and working from, different cities in Australia as well. And that obviously was not available to us during the pandemic either. So yeah, working from airports, working from Airbnbs, those sorts of things as well, which obviously is the beauty of working remotely without the pandemic going on.
I was doing in 2019, we calculated about 25% of my work was online and about 75% face-to-face. And I had an ambitious target for 2020 to get to 50% online. And of course, it's been 100%. It's now shifting back to about 90%. But it's been absolutely great. It has been a much more effective use of my time. I have spent less time dashing around like a mad thing on trains and in cars. I've made new connections. I've worked much more effectively and collaboratively with yourself, Pilar, but also with other colleagues who somehow we never found the time to connect when it meant meeting face to face. But we're finding the time to connect now because we've reorganized our lives. It's been a brilliant learning experience. I've absolutely loved it. I thought I was pretty good at virtual working and I hadn't even started, and so it's been a great learning experience. And professionally, two of the most interesting and exciting years of my life, being able to teach people what I knew, but then also being able to learn so much more from others. So overall, it's been really positive. And strangely, I guess maybe my career stage, I don't miss the face-to-face very much. Sure, it'll be nice to meet you and have a cup of coffee properly. But I don't actually miss it very much. I think it's been really beneficial.
How about what's at the core of our work, of ourselves as humans? How has the way in which we look after ourselves changed over the last 3 years? How about the way in which we connect with others? Mark Kilby is going to kick us off. He's a general remote guy. We'll hear again from Richard and then Eva Rimbau-Gilabert, who's a professor at the Open University of Catalonia, will share how her work practices have changed with her colleagues. Tim Burgess follows, who during the last 3 years has been leading a distributed organization he co-founded. And he was the person who came up with the idea of doing a season together on loneliness in remote teams. So following that, we'll hear again from Bree, who hosted that whole season.
For me, it was even more about energy management and self-care. With all the turmoil that was happening the last 3 years, not just the pandemic, but some of the racial issues. Now we're dealing with wars and whether you say it's war atrocities or not, And just to be immersed in that and shifts in how you work really means you got to pay really close attention to your own self-care. And I certainly stumbled over the last 3 years and had to reset many things that I do. And sometimes that means stepping far away from the screens.
I suppose that I've looked for and experimented with ways of collaboration via technology to, iron out the wrinkles of being truly asynchronous. Working on things in a way that means we don't have to be live at the same time. And unfortunately, there is no one perfect tool, right? But it is about matching what can it do with what do we need to get done with a minimum of fuss and bearing cost in mind as well.
Beyond having many more virtual meetings, which I didn't have before, since everybody is working remotely much more, they relied in remote meetings. I as the only one who was remote before, I wasn't expected in meetings. But now I'm expected everywhere. so because everybody can attend, so I have more meetings. But also we are turning towards more asynchronous communication. We're learning about that. And so I think that other organizations like mine, but many others are trying to learn to work in a more diverse manner, to allow for remote work in the same capacity as they allow for face-to-face work. I'm happy about that. I think it's not something that we can see generally, but I think there are more and more organizations that are trying to improve in this way, and I think we should be quite happy about that. Insufficient, but a good trend.
What I found, particularly in this sort of second stint of it, was I had a lot more interaction inbuilt into my day-to-day work. Sort of forced socialization, I guess you could call it. I mean, I wouldn't say it's forced because it was pleasurable, but it was an integral part of my work. I didn't really have to reach to get it, and that made a massive difference to me.
Knowing the level of interaction that we need to make our work, call it fun, pleasurable, exciting, motivational, whatever, seems to be really key.
For me, definitely, yeah. And I think for most people, that's one of the big fears that people have, I think, around shifting circumstances is, people talk about it as collaboration or as FaceTime or, visibility or as friendship. So really they're human connections. Like you say, the level that you want to get, if you're worried that it's going to be at risk, then it can bring a lot of anxiety.
I'm thinking that I need so little interaction that if I'm getting too much, it stresses me out. And I've become more aware of that recently. I think because the level of interaction has varied and has sometimes been out of my control. And I've noticed that actually, that one of the reasons why I like working in remote teams is that the level of interaction can be quite low. So that's interesting. During the last 3 years of the podcast, we did something that we hadn't done before, which is that you took over you took over a season which we'd never had before, and the season was about loneliness in remote teams. We called it connection and disconnection in remote teams. I'd love to hear, and of course the pandemic hit in the middle of it, so we'd love to hear as well how that changed the conversation. But I'd love to hear what you took from that, and if that changed anything in your approach to how you worked.
Yeah, I think it really did. I learned a lot from that experience, not just, even just going through it, but just speaking with so many, thoughtful people in this, I guess, industry or in this community. I think the most thing that I realized, and it was very reflective during the pandemic, was that, previous to that, it was quite intuitive to me to, all right, experiencing a slump in productivity, or I'm feeling a little bit like I need to leave the house. And it was very intuitive for me to just pack up my laptop and walk down the street to grab a coffee, or, meet a friend for lunch or something like that. But when all of those parameters were sort of taken away during the pandemic, trying to identify what it was that, helped me in those moments and trying to replicate that in my new environment of home was quite difficult, but not impossible. I was able to identify, oh, okay, changes in scenery is very important to me when I'm moving through tasks. And so in my new setup at home now, I have the deck set up and I have my office set up, and I quite often move between the two of them throughout the day. And that gives me a similar sense of energy boost, change in scenery, change in environment that I'm looking for, or was looking for pre-pandemic when I would, walk down the street. And that's not to say I don't do that now, because it's available to me again, but I had to learn those skills almost again during the pandemic and utilize what was available to me during that time.
What about the tech? Technology is key in working remotely, but something I've noticed is that some people new to remote work are still separating the tech from their teamwork. Like it's an afterthought or something separate, but actually it's key. It's key to getting it right. You need to get the tech right, because that's what enables you to communicate. The main difference between being a team that shares a physical space and one that works remotely is that you communicate through the technology at different levels, but that's the main difference. So Tim is going to kick us off. Then we'll hear from Ross Winter, our podcast polisher, although I did save him the pain on working on this set of episodes. So any audio gremlins are mine.
I mean, so much has changed within the nature of the work that I was doing. I went from being a manager of individuals to a manager of managers, and that's a big shift. And I think the way that I tried to lead became a lot different, better for me, I think. And also things like I gradually created boundaries with Slack and email, which made my work much more sustainable. And also, I spent a lot of time playing around with different communication mediums, video messages, presentations, workshops and group discussions and those sort of things, which was really pleasurable and made work a lot more interesting, particularly as someone at the head of an organization. I was a co-founder along with Duncan. There's lots of opportunities to communicate with people in different fashions and to different outcomes. And playing around with that was just a joy for me. I think it's made me a better human being, to be honest. If you know that you have to deliver a message and you're only allowed to do it on this PowerPoint deck that's already got all of these like stock images in it, or, and you have to use these particular type of bullet points and blah, blah, blah. Like, it's very sterile and there's not much opportunity for expression. There's not much opportunity for you to bring yourself into the work. Whereas once you start to remove those barriers and play with it, then I think there are lots of opportunities to bring yourself more into the work, and it's more engaging. Within reason, the more that you can feel like yourself while you're doing your job, the better it goes for you and for the people that you interact with.
Well, I've adopted practices from my clients. The channels of communication have become more diverse. I think this is going back beyond 3 years, I suppose, but email compared to Trello checklists. We used to use email to conduct the production process of a podcast. Would be like, oh, here's the files, and then you work on the files, you send another email and say, the files are ready, I've uploaded them to a distribution platform, and it's just a very clunky way of working, and emails would be lost in amongst loads of other emails, and then you'd have to go and search it out. Whereas if you're working on Trello, you can just literally tick off a checklist and then send a notification to the relevant person to say that task is completed. So, yeah, much more efficient.
So thanks to all our guests for letting us into their lives. And this is something that we've heard a lot recently during the pandemic, how team members, people have got closer to each other during that period. And This is not something we were hearing about regarding remote work beforehand, although maybe there were pockets of conversation, but this is something definitely that, because of the circumstances as well, it's brought that in, and some people have really embraced it. The more, would I say unpopular? It's really interesting. What I've been seeing this since I started in this space, that one conversation we never hear is that working away from your colleagues can help you have a better relationship with them. Because as much as we all want to love everyone on our teams, that's not always the case, and that's okay. And I always thought that remote work allows you to control that interaction a bit more so that you can manage those relationships a bit more. My friend Sue, I was having lunch with her yesterday, and she was saying, well, doesn't that mean that then you never get close to people and therefore you never get that amazing work relationship, which is helped and supported by your personal connection? Doesn't mean that that doesn't happen again, but I think that actually, I think it's a benefit sometimes from being able to work physically away from those we need to collaborate with. And this is very personal. The other thing that I always thought was great about remote work was that you could separate your work from your non-work hours, something that didn't happen during the pandemic a lot, especially at the beginning, and also just have more control over how you spend what you want to be your work hours and your non-work. So in a moment, Eva is going to help us frame that conversation. But first, let's hear how Richard will pick up where he left off, talking about our relationship with tech, and he does love it. He's very mindful about its use as well. Bree will chime in, and I'll also share how my week has changed.
It's high up on my list that if we are doing more remote work, if we are spending more time communicating via technology, we need to be mindful that our pastimes don't simply represent an extension of that, and that we are mindlessly using the same technology and not giving ourselves a break from it.
I'm almost curious about, is that work is just, a piece of life? And I think I've had the freedom to experience potentially that flexibility around setting my own schedule a little bit more over the last few years, and particularly when I have an example of when I came back to Australia, I had to do hotel quarantine. So I was in a hotel for 2 straight weeks with my husband, and we couldn't leave the room. I had all our food delivered, all those sorts of things. And so in that circumstance, we just chose to work shorter hours, but every day. So we didn't take any breaks over 2 weekends because we just were like, what else are we going to do? This makes this makes the most sense. And, I'm not going to say that made it, ultimately a fun experience or anything like that, but it was what worked in that circumstance. And I can see similar things to that happening now when more companies are open to, I guess, a more flexible approach. So, I have a travel day today, I'm not going to be working much, but tomorrow I'll work a little bit later to compensate and those sorts of things. And of course we really want to, watch that and make sure that balance is truly happening and we're not just working ourselves into the ground by any means. But I don't know, I'm really curious about how work is just kind of integrated into life and not this that has these rigid start finish times of, where we're going and when, we're going to the office and now we're at home and end of discussion, that it's kind of, I don't know, integrated into the ebbs and flows of what makes up life as well. Does that make sense? I don't know.
Completely. And there was another guest, Richard McKinnon, said something very similar.
That I do as well now. I used to be quite let's put a Berlin Wall between work and home, but I've realized now I quite like to dip in and out of things if it suits me and if it's an enjoyable or rewarding activity. So for example, I'll regularly pop into my office at the weekends just for a couple of hours to record some content for the YouTube channel, where it just really suits me to do that. Whereas before I would have been no work at the weekends at all. Don't even look at it. If you look at it in the round, I get a benefit from it. So why be inflexible about it?
Friday is a day without an agenda. I've got an exercise class I go to quite early, and then my one thing I want to do on Fridays is go and have a coffee at the Riverside Studios and see what happens, or my singing. and that Friday is a pause. When I come to Saturday, just because of how my husband and I live as well, on Saturday mornings, I do the same thing. I go to the Riverside, I get out of the house so that Kevin can do his music stuff that he adopted during the pandemic. He takes out all his stuff. And then on Saturday afternoons, because we don't have a social life like this, I do podcasting and I work or I catch up. And some people look at me funny when I say I work on Saturdays. Well, it's a day that I really enjoy now because of how I'm managing my Friday. So it's becoming more acceptable to say, I will let my personal stuff come into my work hours. But I don't think it's yet acceptable to say, I'm going to let my work hours go into what we would consider personal time. I think they're still like, oh, are you sure? Well-being and all that. It's like, yeah. So as I promised, here's Eva to help us frame the conversation and add a little bit of vocabulary to our discussion, followed by myself. I always have to have an opinion, and then we'll hear from Simon.
Some of us are integrators. We like to mix work and private life. Other people are separators and want really to divide those two spheres of their life. And probably these two trends are more clear for all of us who have been able to telework in the past years. People who wanted to separate now are very, very clear that they want to separate, and how are they going to do that? And maybe that's why many people prefer to go to the office, so they can separate work and life, private life. And others like me, who are heavy integrators, just integrate more happily and can combine one activity after the other during the day, maybe in ways that before were not so free or so fluid.
The work-life balance conversation, which has traditionally meant that we have a rigid time structure around our work, and then we don't go out of that. That's basically what work-life balance has meant. Generally has been, I stop my work so I can have my life, and then I balance. I think that belongs to the old way of working now. That the work-life balance now means finding a space, finding a life where we are happy with how work is integrated, and we feel it's a balance and that is not taking over or not there as much as we would like it to, because there's those bits.
I've run a small business for 20 years, and I've worked with large organizations for 20 years. So my business has been small and my clients have been large public sector bodies. I always believed that work-life balance was really important. I think that the last 2 years have shown that it really is possible to change your relationship with work and the rest of your life. And the core to that, I think, for a lot of knowledge workers, not all, is being home-based, which I always have been, but being home-based, working more virtually, organizing the time yourself. What I would say is that I've also got that wrong in the last 2 years. So there have been periods in the last 2 years where I allowed those virtual meetings just to stack up and stack up and stack up and stack up. And that crowded out everything else. That possibility, you could actually have 20 Zoom meetings in a day. Why not? 30 Zoom meetings in a day. Why not? It's possible in that way. So there's an understanding that the work-life balance can change. But the fundamental issue is how we deal with meetings, and this issue around the asynchronous side becoming the key organizational skill, I think, for the next 5 years. And that's what shifted for me. I knew it intellectually, but I now know it really.
And what are people getting from their work? Let's hear from Mark Kilby, Tim Burgess, and Ross Winter.
I don't know that it's changed just over the last 3 years, but it's become more important over the last 3 years that not only do my clients get value out of the work, but I get value out of the work. because I will put heart and soul into whatever I'm doing. So if I'm not getting value out of that, I'm just going to burn out, and have come close to that at times. But if I love what I'm doing, a 12-hour day is like a 2-hour day to me. Now, yes, I'll take breaks after that once I'm done with a push of getting something done, but I'm so energized from what I've learned or helped people connect that is what really fuels me. And I hope it's the same for others, that they're seeking what value they're getting out of the work and not just their customers and their clients.
For me, work became an opportunity to grow as a person. Companies became a way to build a collective of people that were bonded together in a way that was greater than its individual parts. And especially leadership was a way for me to become a better human being. I hope. It certainly was my intention. Because you need to be able to collaborate with different types of people. You have to have different styles of approaching people and addressing them. And you also have to be able to address both your strengths and your weaknesses and the shadows of those strengths. Every quality we have that we're really good at also have some downsides to it, or some things that are not so helpful to us. So I found that a very, very rewarding process. And that changed a lot for me as I sort of adopted that perspective, which is not something that was in any way unique to me. I've been reading and listening to all sorts of people to come to that sort of place.
So I used to think that work was something quantifiable in time spent, but I think now it's more of a combination of insight, knowledge, and experience compressed into the present time that I've spent on something. I mean, I've been editing podcasts for about 10 years now, and longer than that I've had a studio. I mean, I picked up a guitar when I was 16, I got a drum machine when I was 18, and that was kind of the beginning of my studio, really, and I've just built it up for 40 years, well, not when I was a baby, of course, but, about 30 years. So all those little experiences and other projects that I've done kind of come and tie in together. And there's times when I'm doing an edit or doing a project and I'll draw on all these experiences. And I guess that's where I draw value from and put it into the time I spend on something. That's how my views changed, yeah.
So it sounds like we all have aspirations of what our life could be like, how we want our work life to be. But a lot of us work within organizations, which means that we can change, but only if our organization has the right context, culture, and also if our organization changes. So before we move on to the broader picture about what we think people out there think about the role of work in other aspects of life, here's Eva again, and she's someone who has been working remotely from a different city to her team and the HQ of her organization, which was an office-centric organization for many years. And so, big thumbs up to the Open University of Catalonia that I had the pleasure to work with, because from the beginning, they were incredibly conscientious and forward-thinking about the challenging period. But anyway, I'm going to let Eva tell you about that. Then we'll move on to Anish Hindocha, who we haven't heard from for a while, to share how he sees new ways of working, opening up people's opportunities in how they lead their lives, their works, and their other relationships. Tim will follow, and then Simon.
I've seen a change in my organization, which I'm thankful for. My organization has decided to be more open. We talk about open work is our new organizational model, and my organization has decided to leave people decide how much they want to work at home and at the office. So more sensitivity has developed towards those who are remote. So that is me. And for the first time in many years, I've heard people ask me how is my participation in a hybrid meeting going, for example? And that has improved very, very clearly in my case.
I'm thinking that it would be very interesting to see some research that asks the question, if you've been traveling or commuting for more than 2 hours a day pre-pandemic, what are you using that time for now? And I think there'd be a large proportion of people who would put those extra hours back into the company. So we know the research suggests that lots of people working remotely put in extra hours from home. But there must be some proportion of people who are using those hours in another way, maybe to develop a hobby or an interest in an adjacent career, developing a side business perhaps. So I think the rise of the portfolio career might be something that changes from the present onwards, and the increasing rise of the gig economy. The other thing I see happening is the affiliations people make with people outside of their organization. We've all become a little nomadic, haven't we? And many of us want a change of scenery from our home. So the rise of flexible workspaces, but in smaller, more provincial towns, I think, will lead to people making interesting connections. And I think that, again, loops back to this idea of the rise of the portfolio career. I myself belong to 5 different communities. One's the facilitation one. There's another one on change. There's another one on culture design. There's a couple of others which I'm associated with as well. So you can start to see how the opportunity to extend your network becomes something that's easier because you may not work from the same space all the time, but B, desirable because you're getting to extend and share knowledge with other people you may not necessarily have been in contact with.
I remember having a conversation with Jennifer Kim years back, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and we were talking about remote, which was still a bit of an oddity back then, and we talked about how flexibility was the thing that people really wanted. Remote was just one aspect of it. Where you work, when you work, how you work are all subsets of people's overarching desire for flexibility. And I think even if you take a step back from that, it's this idea that we want to have some cognitive consistency between who we are and our work, and even who we perceive ourselves to be as people and who we perceive ourselves to be at work. So I think remote is and particularly the massive shift that happened with the pandemic, where this change was forced on a lot of people, has been a wonderful opportunity to revisit, almost like a reset, where people were forced into a situation where they got to re-examine, what am I doing here, and why am I doing it in this way, and am I happy with this? Is this what I want? And now I've tried something that's quite different. If you think about people just before the pandemic to people 6 months after the pandemic, obviously massive, a lot of other stuff going on, and a lot of other factors playing into it, but their experience of work was dramatically different just over that period.
Generally, I've been asking people these questions to reflect on where we've got to. And I think absolutely. The number of people who have said to me, I'm never going back to how things were. This change is something which has opened up opportunities. And the principal focus has been on work-life balance, and therefore, the relationship between work and the rest of my life. Where I don't think people have really got into deep understanding yet is the nature of work itself and how we change the way in which we organize and structure and deliver work. I think there's some straws in the wind about that. So people understand that their working lives will not be the same in future. What I don't think they've quite got is a sense of agency of how their working lives are going to be different.
And to pick up quickly on this last point, yes, we need to shift the conversation from how many days a week are we going to work in the office to do we need to change how we carry out our work? And what are we getting from our work? What's the work doing for us? And thinking about this, we might realize that it's not where we're doing it from that will give us a sense of autonomy and joy, but it could be how we're carrying out a process or the time we're giving to it. And it's a much wider conversation, and I hope that we'll be reading and hearing more about it. I did come across an article recently about this, about how we're forgetting about designing the work so that we stay engaged and happy. But I can't find it. I think it was in the Harvard Business Review online, but I didn't save it. So listeners, if you have any thoughts on this or any resources I could have a look at and share with other listeners, please let me know. Pilar at virtualnotdistant.com or LinkedIn or Twitter if that's easier for you. Now, let's go back to the broader question of how we think people are seeing the change in how we work affect the other aspects of their life. In particular, when we are using our homes for work. So Mark Kilby will kick us off, followed by Richard and Pinar.
When I first started working remotely this way, most of my work is work from home. Now, I do some nomadic work, but it's mostly work from home. And so I get to see my kids every day. I get to mix work and home life. And it made me think of those craftsmen from the 1800s and the 1900s who their shop was attached to their house. and that was their life. They literally took a few steps from work into home life and back. And in a way, we've kind of returned to that. And I think some will realize this might be a far more sustainable way to work. And what does that mean for me on what I want out of an employer? And so I think there's going to be more shifts for people who are intentional in how they work and wanting to work well. They're going to look for employers that value that, and hopefully employers will seek that out as well.
More broadly, for people, they've seen the way that boundary management is so important when your work invades your home, that you need to be proactive about that. But they've also seen the benefits of not commuting long distances and the benefits it has for their personal, for their family lives. And I think a lot of us have just looked anew at what it means to be an employee and what's required, what's needed, what's possible. And so we've got lots more people wanting to live somewhere nicer and work more remotely more often. And that's not because they want to use the technology, it's because they want something different for their lives.
I think before, work and the professional career success was defining the person. So I think we were defining ourselves through our professional successes, our work successes. I think now people are going beyond that. We also see this, I think, around corporations. So they are no longer defined by their commercial success, right? So it's very similar with people. So I think we're beyond the corporate success. We're beyond the personal professional success. Something, I think, more intangible, but a lot more meaningful in that sense.
And when we look at how work fits into our lives, we start to think beyond location, beyond flexibility that allows us to do certain things at certain times, beyond how much time we free up to do other things. And we start to see how it affects our psychology. So I'll let Tim go into that and see what thoughts he sparks off in Ross. Well, I'm making that up, of course. They didn't hear each other speak, but they complemented each other.
The idea that you used to have to, put on a suit or business clothes in order to, catch a tube, in order to go into an office where, it was a grey cubicle where you weren't allowed to have anything personal and all this sort of stuff. Like, it was all separating people from, who they felt they were. Like, and then you end up with these things like, oh, it's just business, don't take it personally. And I think that's really damaging. I think it hurts people. It damages people and it limits their potential massively. So the more I think we can move to a scenario where you can feel like yourself, however that may play out. It doesn't mean you have to be your whole self at work, but be a self that you recognize. The more we can get to that, I think the better it is for everyone.
The current trend in influencers and online presence has changed, and I think there's a more overlap in work life and social life, and we're kind of presenting these different personalities in an online space, and we have multiple accounts for various things, and it gets, there's some people can cope with that and some people can't, and I think that's how it's changed in general. We've gone from being individual personalities to become sort of meta personalities.
So the issue of working in new ways, affecting how we see each other and how others see us, I think is also a topic worth exploring. So listeners, do get in touch if you have any thoughts. Again, what's really obvious is that the conversation of what work is for, who am I at work, what do I want to get from my work, how it's affecting my relationship with others, what effect does it have on the other aspects of our life? This conversation is expanding. And yes, I know some of us have been having it for ages, and we probably can find, stuff from decades and decades ago around it. But I think that the last 2 years have prompted the question in the minds of people who'd never had the time to think about it, who'd never been given license by those around them to think about it. I remember a conversation of, what are you thinking? Work is just work. Well, why do you need to overthink what it's for? I think that that's been the difference, and we'll see. I mean, we'll see if we can continue to have that in a way that makes sense. So we'll see where it all goes. So for some more hypothesizing on that, here are Pinar and Maya.
Well, I think the meaning of work is redefined. Before, I think this period, we've been thinking, we all had a certain definition of work. And this was more or less the same for many people, right? So, I mean, especially people who were working in the corporate environment. So now I think we're discovering, and we're still discovering, I think, the meaning of work for us in our lives now that we have lived, a certain period which I think shook all of our beliefs. I think the meaning of work for us is being redefined. So why do we work? How do we work? And what is the place of work in our lives? Those are all things that I think we're talking about and we need to talk about. So I think this philosophical inquiry will continue in the workplace, especially when we combine it with the younger generations.
And I was talking to somebody the other day about the words we use and for sort of remote work or location independence and digital nomads and all that. And we decided after talking about it for a while that in the future we probably won't need any of those terms because we'll just talk about work, and everything else is not irrelevant, but it's kind of secondary. The where we do it and the how, because so much of it will be online anyway. I think I've always known that, even if I didn't articulate it. But what it feels like the shift now is that when people are talking about work, they maybe mean more what they do rather than where they go, or even who they do it for. I think there's more of an inclination to talk about what your work involves rather than who your employer is or where you happen to be. So I think that's an important shift we're going to have to keep an eye on.
Well, listeners, we've come to the end of the second part of this celebration of the world of work and all that the last 3 years have given us. The next part 3, will be more focused on the podcast. But even if you're not that interested, or if you're new to the show and you're like, well, I'm not sure I want to listen to a show about the podcast itself, guests have some interesting insights when they share what they'd like to be covered in the show. So it will be a shorter episode. So stick around. And if you're a regular listener, I think you'll really enjoy it. And if you are enjoying these conversations and want a bit more, then look out for the new show that I'm going to be releasing, which will have the full conversations. It will be a short a podcast with a very limited number of episodes, obviously, but I will let you know. I'll be back here to let you know. But in any case, make sure you are subscribed to the show so that when that other podcast comes out, you can do that on your podcast app. If you're listening to us on our website, then look for us in any podcast app. We are everywhere. And if you can't find us, let me know, because I'll do something about that. You can email me, pilar@virtualnotdistant.com. And indeed, if you go to virtualnotdistant.com, we have loads of blog posts, show notes to the other podcast episodes, and information on what we are doing for managers and leaders of remote teams. My name is Pilar Ortiz. Thank you for listening, and see you in part 3.